Um, we have a few questions from quite a few people, so pardon me if there's a little noise when it's moving, but nonetheless, we'll do our best. This one's from Todd Hughes. Has to do with ley lines, and many of you are familiar with the concept of ley lines and the relationship that a lot of beliefs apply to them, and beliefs are very varied on these lines around the planet. And Todd and his friend are very curious about these things. Todd not so much, but he's curious in relationship to what may or may not happen because of the large numbers of people who appear to be quite brilliant, who lived in and around or very close to these ley lines. They have been thought to be aspects of the magnetic field around the planet, or what you might call spiritual lines of engagement related to the etheric or astral planes. Could be any one of these. There's a whole lot of argument. People argue for one thing versus another. But there's one thing that's very interesting that aligns with concepts that perhaps some of you already know. And the concept of engagement with emotion and the emotional and mental planes are really diverse, but their engagement is to consider kind of the intellectual orientations of some of these brilliant people. So if you can consider this, the intellect is involved with emotion and mind. This is often just considered mind from many people's point of view. I split it up a little bit because the intensity that a person has in their will or their emotion often directly relates to the endocrine gland system. And the use of these glands for the purpose of moving an individual through life based on the intensity that they have learned to garner as they have grown up, based on watching their parental intensities, or just a reflex intensity that happens to be a carryover from other lifetimes, or an engagement with how you believe you have to be to stand out in a relationship with other people. And it's usually unconscious and very reflexive. So let's take a look at that just for a second or two and consider the possibility that the mental plane is protected and engaged with through the auspices of the emotional disposition. That is the lower intellectual and mental plane. So what we do when we're learning is we build small structures to identify within our minds ideas or movement towards planning design of how to function, solving problems of various types. And we're using our emotional will, our memory, and also a kind of instinct that relates to, that needs to relate to an understanding as well. In other words, we have to make sense of the instinctive responses that we are moving towards expressing as we're involved with the dialogue with others. In doing that, we also know that we reach certain points where Belief enters in, as a concept or as a reality, enters into how we function in our world. Beliefs serve many really positive purposes and some not so positive. But nonetheless, it emphasizes and shows us our relationship with our emotional, reflexive engagement with existence, with life. Part of our method of engaging with others. We have an idea, we tend to defend it, we argue for it, argue meaning in a soft way, trying to make sense of it. When we're doing that with others, it's also a process of thinking. We often don't know what we think until we begin to describe what we think. We think. And if you're really watching, paying attention to this, you're actually watching what comes up next in your mind. If you could eradicate or speak about, let's say, better words, everything that comes up in your mind until you have nothing coming up in your mind, that would be dealing with all the emotionally mental stuff that you have considered before, are considering now, and perhaps some that are projections of what you have considered valuable before as well. After some folks, after that's over, recognize they believe a certain way, and then they move to defend their ideas as they've just expressed them. This is a normal way of engaging with others and themselves, actually. Usually we stop too quickly with that kind of an interaction with ourselves. As soon as we come up with an idea that seems to be okay, valuable, and kind of a semi-projection of what we already think, we kind of push the brakes on, not consciously, but kind of unconsciously. Now that stoppage is meant to give us a chance to think about things. But if we have a few other people around and we're all dialoguing, then stuff is added on top of that based on what other people say. That becomes a kind of personalized version of what dialoguing is, but you're really self-dialoguing. Not a negative thing, but sometimes a good idea. Helps you to understand, if you can allow yourself to do so, that you did not come up with the catalytic idea that stimulates you to think of another idea. Somebody else did. And that's a good thing to know with where I'm going in this one. To see the difference between, and acknowledge the difference, and recognize and understand there is a difference in the mind between the idea that you start with and the idea that you finish with, if you're with 3 or 4 people, is a good idea, because that is the influence that can be done through the influence, rather, of perception. So you're allowing yourself to perceive that there are differences between one or the other, and you're trying to work with softening down the need to protect yourself. Eventually, this becomes extremely important. And why am I on about this? Well, the idea of a brilliant mind often relates to a kind of sample of what 16th, 17th concepts of genius was. They considered there was a possibility of a muse. Of course, we don't dialogue like that anymore, because everything is done through our heads. And it's ours, very highly personalized now. But our self-protection is highly indented into the stage of needing to self-protect for the purpose of being valued by others, and by yourself as well. We do not understand the concept of broadening out very well. We understand the individual aspects of it. And because we constantly are self-protecting, This is very reminiscent of what a higher state engager mentally might come up against. They hear themselves thinking or perceive images of what they're thinking in their mind, and that allows them to be, and they hold that, and in a quiet way, almost like a silence. They don't want to add anything. They don't want to call it right or wrong. They want to hold it until a new concept comes in to their mind. In some of the traditional ways of engaging with this kind of perception relates to a recognition that there is a difference between what you come up with and the idea that comes into your mind next. This concept, if it could be perceived by an individual, might be called a muse, as they did in the 16th century and prior to that. Or it might be called a connection with another state of mind, where a state on the frontier of the mental facility, mental emotional facility, has reached the edges of its capacity to understand something and remains on the frontier, willing to be quiet enough and receptive enough, another way to say that, to be curious about what might enter into your mind from a higher mental state, or another aspect of the mind, you could call it. But the definition of mind gets very broad here, much broader than the definition of your mental reflexive response to defend the ideas that you believe have to be true versus somebody else's ideas. This is a very valuable, from my perspective, of course, and all of you out there are thinking people, valuable and curious way to engage with considerations beyond belief. Beliefs are extremely valuable. They are places where you can rest your attention, be considerably comfortable, and allow yourself to broaden out and consider other things, because you still have your beliefs to fall back on, or they may be extended into an idea that makes some sense, even though you still have the same relative belief, but you've extended or broadened out the belief into a different consideration of what that previous image might mean, or a new image combined with the previous image might mean. So you look for joiners, mental joiners. How does this fit in my mind? It doesn't make any sense to me initially. And suddenly, you begin to look for branches that link up, bridges that link up with concepts that have entered into the mental sphere, but the intellectual sphere looks to see how they might fit. If they don't fit from your perspective, then you put them in the back of your mind and wait so that you can reconsider the bridging between this concept or other concepts and the beliefs that you already maintain. This was called genius in the old school, 20th century stuff, because people will come up with ideas seemingly out of nowhere. The benzene formula is an old example of this. There's so many examples. Um, Todd talks about Nikola Tesla theorizing about wireless energy transfer. This is a concept way ahead of his time. To be able to allow himself to entertain ideas broader than the current timeline is difficult enough because others around him thought he was a little loopy from time to time. Most people, no disrespect to anybody, engage with ideas that they feel comfortable with and hold their relationship right there. And that's a natural tendency for us all. It helps us to survive and to maintain the relationship with how we normally function. No disrespect meant to anybody, any idea whatsoever. But to broaden out an idea is to move into a state. Now, this is an idea not intellectually engaging, with the next step in the same projection, but an idea related to being okay with perceiving in a silent place, a quiet place in the mind. It's a stretch. Ideas that may enter. Now, often these ideas, it's really interesting how this seems to work. Ideas you will have ideas about things, and it's great. And then you go look to see whether they're true, based on other people's ideas. This is a natural, normal way. We're taught this all over the place. I mean, if you take university courses in English, philosophy, I don't care where it is, you go looking for the originator of that idea. As a matter of fact, truth is, historically, only a few people are engaged with original ideas, right? Not true, though. We engage with ideas all the time that may be similar to others, but we never met those others, never read those others, had no idea that others had thought of this idea or that idea. I remember somebody telling me one time, there is never an original idea. Somebody else has already thought about it. I think this is a lot of baloney. But I think the actual act of attempting to engage with ideas is not as easy as people think it is. And the influence of our culture is strong in our world. So ideas are not easily obtained. And I'm talking about ideas now that are quite a bit different than what might be projections of the world that we actually live in, no matter what timeline you live in. And many of us have lived in many timelines. So you don't know whether you were under some of these ley lines, and now you're trying to make sense of that somehow along the line. Who knows? Anyway, just ideas. Our instincts, it's really interesting. We are tremendously instinctive in the mental plane, the emotional plane, and the physical plane. One could say, whether those are projections from the unconscious level of many of those mental, emotional, physical states, or whether they are intuitive from another state, a higher emotional state, higher physical state, a higher mental state, is always up for grabs because we can't very easily tell the difference. And with all due respect to everyone who comes up with an idea, the idea isn't necessarily anything other than a projection. And we live in life and we move through life, sally through life, doing our waltzes and our particular dancing. And it really suits us to feel comforted by the assessment that we come up with relative to ourselves. This we should know for sure. This should not be something that escapes us. Because if it does not escape us, then we're on the edges of our frontier. Our perception will allow us to perceive things different than what we normally think about, normally respond to, normally engage with in relationship to our physical personalities. All of you out there, as human beings, have experienced your personality expressing itself in ways that were surprising to you from time to time. And many times we copy from other people, and many times their stuff that comes out of our mouth is really based on our backgrounds. And it's not too surprising to us. But sometimes it really is. A turn of a phrase, an engagement which is completely different than what we would think that we would speak about. A willingness to not necessarily engage with and defend our will's way of seeing things. That is a definite engagement with another state. A respect for something that others say, even when we say, well, I think I thought about that a long time ago. But the respect that you can have for another person's engagement with a momentary movement within them different than what they normally express is of great value to you. A respect for that in others is of value to you, I'll say it again. Because it allows you to understand that there is something in you that does the same thing. And you can recognize they are of value, and they are attempting to go beyond where they were before. Giving them that credit might be against the reflex to defend yourself in that moment for your particular purposes, certainly purposes that relate to you feeling comfortable with yourself. But it's worthwhile. It broadens out the differences between what you know and what can be engaged with in a higher mental state or a higher emotional mental state. That is really important, because if you're looking at the concept of an individual theoretically living in the proximity of a ley line, coming up with something that's slightly different, it may be that the emotional mind is being numbed by a field that softens the reflexes of the personalization, the will, and the emotional need to defend what the individual has come up with, whatever that may be. And that field may affect or dampen the emotional disposition for the purpose of allowing an entry of a higher mental state into this thing that we call the brain, whereas it would be busy defending ideas that it believes has to be true. It doesn't defend. It looks for and is open to something that may all of a sudden appear. The biggest difficulty with that, of course, is remembering it, because it can disappear in a second. But once it appears, it may appear again, not in the same context, but while you're walking down the road, doing something else. About that time, if these things are happening to you, carry a small notebook with you, because they will happen again. You will miss them 2 or 3 times, same image, same engagement, or something similar. And eventually, you'll just write down something or draw something, and it will remind you of that whole idea. It'll be a link that you draw between an emotional mental state, often called the logical state, and a different state, a state that opens the mind to allowing itself to go beyond the personalized version of what must be true or is valued by you. It shakes you up a tiny bit when it happens 2 or 3 times until you get to the point. And by the way, there will be a reflexive movement. The reflex will happen faster than your conscious awareness in most cases, especially initially, or instinctively, you'll notice, and you'll notice again and again and again. And then your intellectual mind will try to quiet down so you can perceive that other state. And that, of course, in the old traditions, the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions, was called the mind of a sage. And that was, they had, of course, a different perspective. They weren't looking at necessarily at science, but they could. They were looking at trying to engage with the understanding of a field or a higher state and figure out what that meant for them and why it was occurring, and attempt to broaden out that state and bring it down into the emotions and into the physical form. And in doing so, they began to have cities, things that they could do semi-physically. Astral projection, various types of movements, transmission of consciousness, to enable others, helping them. And then they would begin to let go of some of those things because they knew full well that was still aspects of the personality orientation. Very hard to let go on your own. But in a relationship with higher states, the higher states will allow that letting go to get stronger. And of course, you go through all the personality indications that something must be wrong because you're losing your capacity to do what you did before. Not true at all. You never lose it, but you don't use it the way you did before. And often it's not a matter of use anymore. It's a matter of engagement with the moment. Higher states allow that expression to occur so you can perceive beyond your relationship with being in charge and control, while still maintaining an aspect of that relative to the personality form that you have been endowed with. A most wonderful engagement with those sages, of course. And many people would like to be in that state, but really have a very difficult time understanding what that state really entails. This is just some, Todd, some ways of looking at that, especially the muting aspects of reflex reactions. It's really interesting. If you read some of Newton's material, you'll notice, and other people's material, even philosophers, when they're trying to figure stuff out, you'll notice that they're engaging very logically, and then suddenly they make a leap. So they basically, it's like they have to go back and join what they were talking about before with a new leap, a way of engaging and drawing lines between another state and this state. It's very reminiscent of the concepts that you're inquiring about here. It has a really strong impact on the self-interest. If you're really sincerely engaging with this, you'll notice the difference between what you know and what you believe has to be true. And as that softens down a bit, you notice that the new ideas are out of your purview. But there's nobody else that knows that except the person that is engaging with those different states. I find that very, very fascinating, and a real important thing to be honest within yourself about that kind of an experience. If you're really clearly, honestly engaging with you and know how you are, then you'll have a sniff of what you're not. But whether you can handle being honest with people, you have to be, oh, what can I say? One could say that you have to be a little careful because we have so many ideas about concepts of that are valuable versus not valuable, right versus wrong. And we are trained to be critical of others in not so nice a manner. We don't do critiques very well. Otherwise, that would mean that you had some idea of the subject matter that another person was involved with. We do, that is not right because I don't believe that. That's called critical. Critique is something miles different than that, where you're trying to engage with it and asking, have you considered this? Does that make sense to this concept? Is there another way to see that? Yeah, otherwise, I'm trying to figure out how you got to here. Does that make some sense? Can you tell me how you got to there? And if the other person is really looking at it from a point of view where they see that it's an honest question instead of a question that's trying to trip you up, get you really being wrong, they'll say, no, I have no idea where I got that idea. But I think it works with this, and I think it works with that. I've been thinking about it, and it makes some sense here, here, and here. I haven't really come up with something in these other two directions, but nonetheless, it seems to make some sense. But I'm still working on those other two directions. That's something that has to do with internal virtue. We all have imperfections in relationship to whatever you want to talk about. And we do our best, no matter what that sounds like. So there's a place where you can talk to yourself and see what's real for you without the defense that relates directly to needing to be valued in the eyes of others. It's very difficult in that place. But it's important because your questions are pretty interesting. But remember, there's an instinct to go beyond where we are now. There's a driving force, right down to our genes. And there is a driving force internally to survive at a different level, to engage and go beyond where we've been. Because that helps us to understand that there's more than what we believe currently. Now, one could say that doesn't make you feel right, wrong, valid, or invalid, but nonetheless, it does create a kind of a semi-vacuum. And that there's a movement towards filling vacuums in nature. I'm not convinced that there isn't a movement to fill vacuums in mind and emotion. I think it has to do with becoming consciously aware. When you're consciously aware of something, there's an implementation. You could call it a field or a wind or whatever you want to call it. I don't care. It doesn't matter too much. But there's an implication that there's something there that you're not quite noticing, but you're on your way, or could be called on your way, if you consider it worth your while to come up with something more than the next idea that you come up with based on the projections of your own personalized disposition. That's allowed. That's why we read. That's why we broaden out when you're looking at spiritual stuff. Read science, read anything, read books, novels, whatever, because it broadens out your interconnection with life so that you can come up and ask questions that need to be asked. Does this make sense? Is this the same way for everybody? And it truly is not, whatever this may be. Learning about this and being okay with ideas that others have. A very valuable way of engaging with people. We don't seem to do that often. However, we were talking about ley lines. I talked about the dampening of the emotional will and the mind so that some would be willing to listen to something beyond what we've learned in the past. I'm just looking at my notes here. I just was trying to come up with something that might be a little bit more helpful. And I know that our will is cultivated really strongly to protect our personality orientations. It's a strong influence. Using our will to dig into ourselves for the purpose of finding out what might be there, as opposed to disregarding what might be there, is uncomfortable. And I think people like Bacon and Newton and Tesla and all kinds of others, we just get to know historically the ones that really did something. We don't get to know the people who did something after others did something, even if they did it separately. But nonetheless, and we are in a kind of way dumbing ourselves down to try and learn something demands a tremendous amount of will. Having learned it, it doesn't take very much will to try and protect what we believe we've learned. That covers the whole of our life. But it does take another tremendous amount of will to go beyond what we already are engaged with as a personality. I think these folks had a tremendously valuable, almost virtuous in the sense of the old traditional philosophical sense. Virtue meaning an ache to engage with something beyond what you knew before. Virtuous was the universal. Even though they knew that the universal was almost unattainable, when you got really far, it was farther. That's the thing that's pushed us over the centuries. Unfortunately, it's only been the very few that found that interesting enough to spend their lifetime on it. If indeed these plasmic lines, magnetic lines, or fields around these lines of reference dampen our emotional disposition and our intellectual orientations related to belief, just for a few seconds, perhaps meditation does something similar. We try to slow down our relationship with how we function, or concentrate, two options, to deepen our relationship with maintaining an awareness when we don't want to be aware. And when we are able to do that to some degree, then we become really personally self-important because we've done it. That dampens down, but surrounds our personality with a value that holds us back. The dampening was to open the level of another state, allow another state to penetrate and engage with our personalities beyond the boundaries of what we believe is kind of sacred to us. No devaluation intended. It's just what's real for us. Once we know information, or we think we do, it changes our relationship with the movement beyond what we know, no matter what we know, in any given day, any moment of relationship with need to know. More to come, no matter what. No negativity attached to it. Just more to come. Always. No matter who. Doesn't matter. It's a very difficult thing to be okay with. There's a constant automatic reflex to return to a zone where you feel comfortable based on experiences, information, and dialogue that you've had before. This is a normal engagement with spiritual development or universal development, however you term it, whatever terms you feel comfortable with. This happens in science. This happens in all academic relationships. It happens in your normal people who are not involved with any kind of academic background. Pure science, pure arts, happens everywhere. Nothing is negative about this. This is just how it works. And it works culturally. And you watch the reflexes to return to a place that was before, because the future is unknown. So we reiterate, we copy, we engage. Makes us feel better. There is nothing wrong with this concept. Nothing wrong with this action, because this is how many people act. To move beyond that is an act of internal will to soften the defense against the new, or something that is different. Difference in itself is neither good nor bad. Past in itself is neither good nor bad. It's just what was. What is showing up may only be that which gives us a hint into something that will be beyond where we are now. That 1 second that we're engaged with the present is consistently beckoning to us, and we are consistently pushing away from it because we're nervous about the unknown. Many people have attempted, and continue to attempt in our modern world to engage with meditation. They have a terrible time doing it. I've got all kinds of questions about what can we do to continue meditating. Easy, short answer, sit down, meditate. You're busy? Sit down, meditate. Phone rings? Let it ring. Answer it later. You have to write an email? We used to write letters. Take 2 weeks to get there. Now you have to answer it in 2 seconds. Sit. You don't have to meditate long. The habit will help you until you grow. The second you grow, you will have a hard time meditating. You have moved into a present. The past will grab you, pull you back into a state that is more comfortable. You will feel the present pulling you. It will make you a little bit anxious, vulnerable, another word. And you'll wonder why that could be. It's because the unknown is always unknown. And each individual experiences that unknown relative to itself. Not negative at all. But boy, the instinctive will of that strong comfort zone, which exists in all of us. Even some of the sages had difficulty. Hard to believe, of course. So when you write me and ask about that, realize that you are doing exactly what the sages did. Trying to find something else to do so they couldn't meditate until they moved into a state of consistently constant meditation. And some would remain in a lotus position, of course. And some would walk around. The Taoists practiced strong walking meditations. And they did that because they wanted to be meditating without anybody knowing and focused on 2 levels at the same time, a higher state level and this level. And it took its toll. The 2 got mixed up. Had a hard time knowing sometimes that they actually were in a semi-state of meditating, but could have reached a higher state by sitting and meditating. In other words, letting go of their personality. But they did a very interesting thing. They tried to train the personality to be okay with perceiving that meditation state while they were walking around. And it enabled their physical bodies to handle more higher state energies. Same is true when you're doing your lotus work, and you're trying to keep a conscious engagement with higher states until you can shift into a higher state and you can't remember your body at all. So there are many ways of engaging. But if you want the best way to do it, just sit down, meditate. Because you will increase your grumbling about not being able to meditate. And it's not doing you. It's not helping you because it becomes a habit. And you'll find yourself speaking about it quite a lot, actually. And that would become a trademark. Trouble is you won't notice it. It wouldn't be a problem if you did. And then you could laugh and smile and say, oh my God, look what I'm doing. I'm creating a trademark. Isn't it wonderful? I'm a great trademark creator. Todd, I hope that helps a little bit, a little bending off and back on. But we're talking about, inevitably, we're talking about genius. It's quite interesting. What a great subject to understand the practical aspects of genius. Quite amazing. Quite something. Discussed before. By Hindus, Buddhists, by everybody almost. Very philosophical, but in the reality, it's not philosophical. It's active and engaging. And if you find, for example, if you were defending your relationship with an idea because it was yours, you would know your emotional intellectual system was doing the defending. Whenever you defend, that's it right there. Even if you don't speak it out, become aware of it when you're engaging with life. Then you say, oh my goodness, I still do that. How wonderful. That's a good test to see if that is an aspect of you that's relating directly to your emotional planes. Nothing is negative there. It's what we all do. But know you do it. That's the difference. Knowing it means you're allowing yourself to go beyond what you protect to remain the same. Very valuable point of reference. Okay, maybe Doug Legacy had one here. Not so sure I haven't covered some of that. Does perception tend to develop in areas of familiarity first? Pardon my tongue. More than in areas where familiarity may be lacking for the personality. It tends to happen when you're paying attention. And the concept of paying attention is just that, just paying attention. What did I say? What am I thinking? Why am I thinking that? I don't agree with what I'm thinking. Why did that come into my mind? That makes no sense. That's an active perception. If you're talking about a relationship with clairvoyance, clairaudience, whatever, being functional, capable, leaving your body, all of this stuff, remember, you will act if you do not know what you do. You will act the same way as those thoughts in your head. You have to pull back and find out what you agree with and don't agree with. Make some sense of it for you. Because the stuff that comes into your mind, half of it you will just say is nonsense. It just doesn't, it's not true. It's not helpful to you. But you're the one that has to do that, not somebody else. If you do it yourself, you'll start making sense of things from a different perspective, not what is considered by others to be you. But what you're learning about yourself becomes recognizable by you. It's like you're starting all over again. The old concept, unless you begin to be okay with recognizing and understanding stuff that you reflexively engage with, you can't enter into a higher state. In fact, that's only partially true. Higher states, as you're growing internally, will occur in you if you've been in them before. Sometimes they will not occur in you because you have been in them before. And if they came back, you'll get hooked into them. Sometimes they do come back so that the hook can be straightened out. So you can truly understand that this is not helpful for you because You have to go beyond the personalized version, eventually, of what you think a spiritual person is. Meaning, in some people's view, which relates to another question in here, but I won't get to the person, unfortunately. If you become very capable, right, being all of what we believe would be a person of quite significance in so-called personality, or spirituality, you may find that a lot of the stuff that you might be able to do is not spiritual at all. It's just capacity bent. In our world, capacity bent is very valuable. It gives you a sense of importance. It gives others a recognition of what is valuable. This may or may not be true at all, because vulnerability is profound in all of us. For example, if you were to gain access to a higher plane, what way of thinking would you be willing to let go of? What kind of engagement with emotional relationships would you allow to occur, to diminish? How do you think your physical form would respond with tremendous flows of energy moving through it? And how do you think your personality would handle all of this? These are really important questions, not to be devalued at all. Many of the works that are out there about some of this stuff don't answer these questions because they can't. There's no negativity in it. One does their best to help others to understand what they have experienced. And there's more. Here's a question. Why do you lose your so-called spiritual capacities if you call the metaphysical or parapsychological orientations spiritual, as you gain access to higher states? They're not called upon by you in the same way. They may be called upon by you in the aid of others, but not for your own self-orientations. How do we learn this in our world when the world is filled with the need to be important based on what you can do or not do? How do you learn that it's okay to let that go and not be noticed by others? Then you have to ask the question, how would you ever know another person was actually spiritually engaging? That's a legitimate question. Perception is an important key, and it's very subtle. Our capacities are not necessarily as subtle as what we believe, but we're growing. And growth is something that moves in relationship to an internal truth, if you want to call it that, because it's based on how much we can actually handle. So we hope for slow and easy, like a turtle. Well, we don't understand what slow and easy is. I hope I asked some questions that you might consider valuable enough to spend some time on. I certainly spend some time on them. Do the best of my ability. I wish you well with some of the answers. Good night, and thanks for watching.